actually the leap of faith, to give it the memorable name that Søren Kierkegaard bestowed upon it, is an imposture. As he himself pointed out, it is not a leap that can be made once and for all. It is a leap that has to go on and on being performed in spite of mounting evidence to the contrary. This effort is actually too much for the human mind and leads to delusions and manias. Religion understands perfectly well that the leap is subject to sharply diminishing returns, which is why it often doesn't in fact rely on faith at all, but instead corrupts faith and insults reason.
You are listening to A Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates science, secular humanism, and the courage it takes to embrace an evidence-based life of doubt and questioning. You are listening to episode number 8 of A Leap of Doubt. I'm your host, Nathan Dickey. Back in July of 2016, Claire Malone, senior political writer for 538.com, wrote what is essentially an obituary for the Republican Party as we know it today in the form of an article titled The End of a Republican Party, in which she forecasts just that. Before we get into the meat of our discussion, I'm just going to quote from that article. Somewhere in recent years, she writes, the GOP's engagement with modern America and how to best project those values of prosperity, social order, patriotism, and so forth into a nation of 320 million people became dysfunctional. As the country has diversified, the party has remained monochromatic, has grayed, and rather than allowing some birch-like give on shifting cultural norms, has become an unbending oak of ideological purity. The GOP now finds itself lacking an intimate ability to criticize productively, given its demographic and cultural divergence from the majority of the country. My special guest for this episode is John C. Wathey, an author and computational biologist whose research interests include protein folding, evolutionary algorithms, and the biological forces behind religion. He joins me on this episode to discuss what went wrong and what's not working in our current political systems, including his own perspective as an expert on algorithms about what possibilities exist for electoral college reform, the problems inherent in the primaries system, and ways to create a better system that upholds democracy and utilizes science as a way of solving problems. Welcome, John, to the show.
Thank you, Nathan. Good to be with you again.
Oh, great to speak to you again. We had you on my other podcast, Trolling with Logic, last year, and that was a great discussion, and I'm excited to talk about new interests of yours on this episode.
Well, I am too, and people who listen to that first interview may wonder what the hell this has to do with my interest in religion. But in fact, there is a little bit of overlap. I got interested in this mainly because of the Trump phenomenon and what could possibly explain this astonishing phenomenon of a candidate as inexperienced as and manifestly unqualified to be president as Donald Trump, sweeping the nomination and then the election. There actually is a chapter in my book that has nothing to do with elections, but has to do with cults. And I think that's where the overlap occurs. That's what sort of got me interested in it and got me writing about it. I see the Trump phenomenon as largely a cult phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you actually beat me to my first question, which was that some listeners may be wondering how your background in biology, computational modeling of protein structures, and evolutionary algorithms is relevant to the kinds of political questions we're tackling here. And I think that overlap with cults is where it's at. I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, and actually I should say a little more about that question, though, because I should throw in a few disclaimers. I am not a political scientist. I'm not what's called a decision scientist. There's a whole branch of mathematics that's devoted to figuring out how to take a stack of ballots and turn that into a decision that reflects the will of the society at large. I'm not that, but I do have some knowledge of algorithms and computation. I've done a lot of computer programming, a lot of debugging, and I do have an intuitive feel for what's a good algorithm and what isn't. And just almost by accident, I made contact with a very interesting person who showed me an interesting algorithm for voting, and I'm sure we'll get into that later.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, I just want to say, by way of disclaimer, that there are some people who are much more expert at our subject today than I am, but I do come at it from a different direction, and I think I have a few useful things to say.
And I think it's a refreshing direction and a refreshing perspective, because I think it's something that we need to diversify the numbers of perspectives that weigh in on these things, not just from people well-versed in politics, because I think a lot of times people might tune that out just by habit. And people are interested in science even if they don't intuitively understand it. And so I think it's important to come at it from the data and the technical aspects. But to kind of start out in a more broad, general way, to get kind of a bigger picture of what's going on here, there is a giant elephant in the room of modern political discourse, namely the uncomfortable fact that the elephant is dead, or at the very least dying and on its deathbed. The Republican Party is no longer the party of Lincoln that in 1854 emerged in opposition to the pro-slavery legislation of Southern Whigs. What were some of the principles the Republican Party once championed, and when would you say its demise began?
The Republican Party has kind of been the center-right party of American politics for a long, long time. It tended to favor business interests and tended to favor conservative financial or fiscal policies, balanced budgets, responsible taxation and spending, and so forth. The classic example of that, I would say, is from recent history is Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. He came to office at a time when the United States was still staggering under a crushing burden of debt from having financed World War II. And he took that very seriously, and under his administration, the highest marginal tax rate was 91%. I think that predates his administration, but he continued that policy. And he was not shy about taxing the wealthy to pay for World War II and to try to pay down our debt. He was in favor of that. So when that fine tradition of Republican conservatism started to erode, it's hard to put an exact time point on it. And in my memory, it seems to be mostly in the Reagan years, maybe the 1980s, when it began, when it became okay to say the deficits don't matter and we can just cut taxes and raise spending and go deeper and deeper into debt, and that'll be fine. But another contributing factor to it might have been the tendency in both political parties, but maybe it started with the Democrats, I'm not sure. The political parties tried to become in some way more representative, or try to be more sensitive to voters in their primary process. It used to be that there really were no primary elections, that political parties, the bosses of political parties got together in the back rooms and decided who would be their candidates. And a few very powerful men in smoke-filled rooms made these decisions. And then there were a few primary elections to give the voters some say in that process. But it wasn't until around the late 1960s that a large number of states were involved in primaries. And in the current primary system we have now, where many states, essentially all states, vote in primaries, that emerged only in the early 1990s. It's a fairly recent thing. But we have this system where the primaries are staggered, where the very first primaries happen in usually New Hampshire and Iowa, and a very small number of very enthusiastic voters get to determine the outcome of those primary elections. And so this tends to exaggerate the influence of extremist voters, of enthusiastic voters who will get out and vote in these small, seemingly insignificant elections. And the result is that both parties tend to be more polarized because of this. And so it's a little hard to say exactly when it happened, but I would say it's over the last 20 or 30 years that most of it has happened. And I put most of the blame on the primary process, which very few people seem to recognize for what it is, a corrupting influence that is polarizing our politics in a severe way.
Yeah, so you have argued that the problem lies mainly in our primary system and that there's a lot of stuff to fix, but that fixing the primary system is the very first step. would you say in addition to that, it's also the simplest step before we get into all the hurdles of constitutional amendments and so forth that come afterward in the following steps?
Yes, and that's a very good question, actually, very very insightful question, because our problems with politics involve all of the frailties of human nature. It's humans who make these voting decisions, and we are influenced by our intuitions, by our emotions, by subtle unconscious forces acting in our minds that we're not even aware of, most of us. And you as a skeptic know very well that human beings are prone to all manner of fallacious thinking. And it takes real effort of education and discipline, of mental discipline, to avoid these pitfalls of human thinking, of intuition and emotion and distraction from evidence and reason. So ideally, we would like to train our electorate to be good critical thinkers, good skeptics, scientific and rational in their decision making. And that's just really hard to do. It will take decades to accomplish that in a majority of voters. It's a daunting, staggering problem. But there are other fixes available to us that are just much simpler, things that could in principle be done in a matter of a year or so if there were just the political will to do it. And one of them is getting rid of the primary process, getting rid of primaries altogether, replacing that method of winnowing down multiple candidates to just one or two. There are simple, elegant algorithms for doing that.
And before we get into that, I'd like to go back to this larger problem of educating the public about scientific thinking and thinking like a scientist, even though not everybody can be an actual scientist. Everybody has the potential to think like a scientist and like a skeptic. And this is also something you've argued, that there are principles that lie at the core of the scientific method that could be the basis of a political party. And maybe you could describe what those principles are and how they can be incorporated into politics.
Oh, I'd love to. And of course, none of this is unique to me. Other people have argued this too. Mm-hmm. But the essence of the scientific method, of course, is empiricism. If you have some problem you're trying to solve, some question you're trying to answer, you go and you do experiments. You ask nature, and just look at the evidence and see where nature comes down on the question. For some political problem like how best should we manage transportation in our city? Should we build more freeways with wider lanes, not larger number of freeway lanes? Should we put in rail transit? Should we put in more bus lines? How best should we solve this problem? Well, you can address questions like that empirically. You can do the experiment. You could compare. Very often you'll find in an experiment like that, you can find natural experiments that have already been done for you. Different cities have opted for different methods. Some cities have embraced rail transit and built subways and trolleys, and others have built freeways like Los Angeles. And you can compare them and just study how well each alternative strategy works empirically. So what I would advocate is that we try as much as we can to avoid dogma, to avoid party dogma, whether it's liberal, conservative, or anything else, and just look at the evidence. If you have some question that has to be solved, some political question that has to be solved, go and seek out evidence from experiments that have been done in local governments or whatever. Or if they haven't been done, then organize them and do them. Actually set up experiments for trying alternative strategies for solving the drug problem or whatever, and pay attention to the results. Set up criteria for how you will decide whether or not a program is working, and how you will decide which one you'll adopt. So it's entirely an empirical, experimental approach. That's what I have advocated. And in one of the blog posts that I wrote about it, I cited Jacob Bernowski, a famous mathematician and philosopher who used to work at the Salk Institute, who in one of his books advocated exactly this idea.
Yes, I was very pleased that you quoted Bernowski in that article, because Bernowski is one of the intellectual figures I admire greatly. I really love his Ascent of Man documentary series, and he was a mathematician
Yes.
and a scientist.
Yeah, he was interested in many things. He was interested in biology and evolution especially, and he used his mathematical expertise to analyze, for example, the teeth of fossils, hominid fossils. So he had his fingers in many pies and was interested in many different things. But I think he was a mathematician first and foremost.
Yeah, and he was one of those figures who had a very keen sense of the intersection between science and human values and the problems of society, and how scientists need to develop conscientious attitudes towards the consequences of their work on society and embrace the advantages of science in building a better society, but also be aware of the pitfalls and dangers, because he wrote at a time when nuclear warfare was a very real threat.
Right.
And he was also very aware of events like the Holocaust that affected his relatives. He moved around a lot. He lived most of his life in countries that he wasn't born in. Anyway, that was just me kind of going off on how much I love Bronowski. But
yeah, I can't agree more. He's one of my heroes too.
So I kind of like to bring up what detractors and critics might come up with and kind of anticipate what they might say in kind of playing devil's advocate with these kinds of questions. There are two that I can think of. Detractors might say that what you're talking about sounds a lot like what the technocracy movement of the 1930s tried to do, and you raised this as well in your article. Maybe let's talk briefly about the technocracy movement, how what you're arguing differs from that.
Well, my understanding of what they were advocating was that everything was a technological problem and everything had a technological fix. And what I'm advocating is not so much that as empiricism and trying to keep our focus always on the problem we're trying to solve and away from political ideology. Left-wingers have a particular way they want to solve, say, overpopulation. Right-wingers have some way they want to solve it. And Bronowski would say, just focus on the birth rate. Pay attention to the birth rate. And so I guess I would just say that it's not so much a focus on technical fixes as it is empiricism.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And what would a science-based approach to politics look like? How does the ideal of what you call open-minded experimentation with multiple solutions in parallel mimic, for example, or recapitulate biological evolution? And I guess we should make a distinction here. What you're saying mimics it, uses a metaphor for it, but it's not what some people in the past have tried to put forward, which is the social Darwinist philosophy of what we see in nature should be modeled in the way we build our society. What you're saying is completely different from that. You're saying that an open-minded experimentation with multiple solutions in parallel is just what we see in nature, and implementing that in the way we develop policies and social norms and so on kind of retains the option for choice and freedom and doesn't impose anything on people in the way evolution might also do in nature.
Right. And maybe I can clarify that idea a little bit by a specific example. For example, healthcare. How should we manage healthcare costs in America? Healthcare costs in our country are kind of out of control and growing all the time. Everybody complains about it. We don't know what to do about it. We don't know how to fix it. Now, it's a very complicated issue, and I don't pretend to have the answer. I don't. But I do know that in many other areas of economics, a true free market system can work wonders as far as getting prices under control. And we see that most dramatically, for example, in computer technology, where prices of memory chips and CPUs and motherboards and laptops and all these things are always getting cheaper and cheaper and better every year, because they are under intense selective pressures from the free market. Multiple companies are competing to make better products, and there's just intense pressure always on all players in the system to come up with something better and cheaper. So could we make something like that work for healthcare? I honestly don't know for sure, but I do know we haven't really tried in a very serious way. The kind of approach I'm advocating is not so much engineering what kind of healthcare system we should have and where the money should come from and who pays for it and who decides what prices should be paid, but instead a system where all actors must compete, where physicians have an incentive to lower their costs, pharmaceutical companies have an incentive to lower their prices, where everybody is competing in something much more like a true free open market than what we have right now. Right now we have a system where people tend to get locked into a healthcare network or some insurance company or the Medicare system, whatever it is. Most often it's a person's employer. The employer has some relationship with a healthcare network or insurance network, and there's a limited number of physicians that a person who works for this company can go to. We have all these restrictions that prevent the free flow and free competition of goods and services. If we could somehow free that up and have everyone free to compete, where we all know the prices, that's another thing, price transparency. But most people in making their healthcare decisions don't know how much alternative therapies or surgeries or drugs or medical devices, they don't know how much they cost. And if you ask your physician, oh, how much is this surgery going to cost? He won't know either. He will say, oh, go talk to the business office about that. I've actually had that experience. So what I'm advocating is a system where we don't impose rules, we don't impose solutions, but instead we tinker with the incentives. We try to give everyone an incentive to lower prices and let the individual players in the system come to their own solution. Let them find their own way of making the best drugs at the lowest prices, of providing the best services at the lowest prices. That's basically what I'm advocating here is some way of government and politics and voters should tinker with incentives, but not impose solutions.
Yeah, I really like that distinction because I like to think of science as being something that I would argue is inherently political, even though saying that kind of ruffles the feathers of many scientists. But this is also something that, for example, the author Sean Otto, in his long and heavily researched book, The War on Science, Who's Waging It, Why It Matters, What We Can Do About It, in that book, which kind of traces the history of attitudes towards science in the public mind and its relation to social problems from the founding of America to the present day. Otto argues that knowledge and power go hand in hand, as Francis Bacon wrote in 1620, that at its core, science is a method that creates knowledge, and that process of creating knowledge also creates power. It's power that empowers individuals, first and foremost, to ask questions for themselves and not to take the word of an authority figure. So I think that's really important to bring up when we want to view science as a way of solving problems and as a way of exploring solutions to social problems. It's about empowering individuals to make informed choices.
Yes, I agree strongly with that. You were asking earlier about my qualifications and experience and all of this, and what you've just said reminded me of this. I have done an awful lot of work with evolutionary algorithms, and in evolution, in my particular case, my interest was protein folding, protein structure prediction, and that problem, you're trying to solve an extremely complicated problem in a high-dimensional space where this long biomolecule of protein is free to flop around in solution and adopt many, many different conformations in 3 dimensions. But there is one conformation that it ultimately will settle into. It's a low energy state, and that's the folded or native state of the protein. And it's been a long time goal of computational biology to come up with an algorithm that can simulate that process and reliably find the correct native conformation of a protein given its amino acid sequence. It's a very difficult problem to do. And the approach I've tried to take, and I haven't solved the problem either, let me make that clear, but the approach that I take is an evolutionary one where you have some function that describes the energy of the molecule, and you generate random conformations, and you let them flop around and explore the space more or less at random, but not completely at random, because at every stage you go through a selective process and you throw out the higher energy conformations and keep the lower energy ones. And you do this again and again for many, many generations, and it completely simulates the evolutionary process. That's very much getting at what we're talking about here. That approach just sets up the incentive. The incentive for the molecule is to get into a low energy conformation, and that's all you're imposing on it. You're just measuring the energy, and you're letting the individual molecules find their own way of settling into a low energy state. That's a very natural thing. It happens all the time in evolution. All evolution cares about is reproductive success, and how a population of organisms optimizes that is completely free. There are no external constraints on how that happens. And the great diversity we see in biology is the result. But nature comes up with marvelous, wonderful solutions to this problem, each finding its own special way to increase its reproductive success.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like maybe winning a Nobel Prize in physics or chemistry for solving the problem of protein folding might be just as big an accomplishment as a Nobel Peace Prize for work in solving social problems.
Yeah, well, a lot of people are aware of that. It is that big a problem. It is that glorious a problem if a solution could be found. And many people like me have pounded away at it for years, still not solving it. It is still a tantalizing, unsolved problem.
Mm-hmm. So getting into kind of the meat of the data of what we're talking about in terms of a possible fix to this problem, it's important, I think, to kind of establish what it is that people want from a voting system. What attributes are generally accepted as desirable historically and in the present day?
Right. Good question. There's a long list of these. We don't really have time to go into all of them, but the big ones I talk about in some of my articles. First and foremost, I think, is majority, following the will of the majority. What's the point of voting if you don't do that? That's really what you're after. And if you're trying to decide between only two candidates, of course, that's easy. You just take the candidate who wins the most votes. But there's another important criterion that we should care about, and that's maximal choice. We don't often think about that. Our whole primary system is dedicated to winnowing down a large number of choices into only two so that we can use the simplest possible method for deciding the will of the majority. But if you just think back on, say, late summer of 2016, when Hillary Clinton was having all of her problems with the email scandal and Donald Trump was having all of his problems with the grabbing women by the pussy tape and all of that stuff, we had already winnowed ourselves down to two candidates, neither of whom was very popular anymore. And the big complaint that people were saying was, how did our system give us these two candidates? Can't we have somebody else to choose from? But it was too late. Our system had thrown away all of the alternatives by that time. It would be better if we could have a system where we don't throw away the alternatives in a series of primary elections, but instead have a fairly long menu to choose from. So that's one thing. Maximal choice, following the will of the majority. Other important ones are fairness. It's important that everyone be allowed to vote, that nobody's vote be more important than anybody else's. The most extreme case is the dictator situation, where you have a single vote that determines the outcome. That's the most extreme case. But our electoral college, for example, in effect makes little dictators out of everyone who lives in Wyoming compared to people who live in California, because the way the electoral college is skewed, it in effect gives every person in Wyoming 4 votes for president relative to every Californian. So that hardly seems fair. Something's wrong with that picture. And there are other criteria too. For example, you don't want a situation where a minor candidate who has very little support, if you have a list of, say, 5 candidates and you run an election and you decide the winner from those 5 candidates, if you could go back in time and rerun it by throwing in a sixth candidate who was a loser and had very little support, you wouldn't want that sixth candidate's presence to change the outcome of the election, because it's an irrelevant candidate. So you don't want an irrelevant alternative to affect the result. That's another criterion that these decision theorists worry about a lot. There's a bunch of others. I guess the important point we should make is that a mathematician named Arrow back in the 1950s discovered that and proved a theorem to the effect that we cannot satisfy all of these criteria simultaneously. There's no algorithm that perfectly satisfies all of these desired criteria for a voting system. We have to sacrifice some of them. So now we just have to decide which ones are the most important and what algorithm does best at satisfying those.
Which again brings us back to the importance of valuing science as a way of solving problems. And you mentioned that one of the most popular alternatives that people talk about a lot is ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting. And that has a lot of advantages, but it also has a fatal flaw. And maybe you can describe that.
Oh, yes, I'd love to. And maybe the very first thing I should say is to distinguish between ranked choice voting and instant runoff. A lot of people make the mistake, and I have made it myself, of saying that these two things are basically equivalent, that they're just two different words for the same thing. In fact, they're not. What ranked choice voting refers to is any kind of electoral system in which the voters are faced with a slate of candidates, multiple candidates, and what they have to do on their ballots is to rank them in their order of preference. So if you have, say, 5 candidates for president, and each ballot lists the names of these 5, and next to them you mark first place, second place, third place, fourth place, fifth place. You have to rank them in order of your preference by number. That's ranked choice voting. Now, once you have a stack of ballots marked in that way, then you need to apply some algorithm to that stack of ballots to decide how, on average, the whole group of voters ranks them and pick the winner from the stack of ballots. That you have to make a decision using some algorithm. Okay, now there are many algorithms for doing that, and one of them is instant runoff. And we should probably talk about that first, because that's the one that's most talked about. It's the one that it's most used in places where ranked choice voting is used. Before I even explain that instant runoff algorithm, though, I should say that this idea of using ranked choice voting can instantly eliminate the problem of primary elections. And that's kind of the reason for doing it. You get rid of the need for successive primary elections to winnow a large field of candidates down to only 2, because you have a method by which voters rank all of the fairly large number of candidates by number, or give them a preference number. And just by doing that, you can have a single election that replaces the primaries and the general election. So ranked choice voting will give you that. The question is now, which algorithm to use to pick a winner given a stack of ranked choice ballots? And instant runoff is the method that is in some sense most intuitively appealing, because it comes closest to what we do if we have runoff elections. In the instant runoff algorithm, the algorithm looks for the candidate who has the largest number of first place votes among all the voters. And if that number is a majority, if more than half of the voters give one candidate, their first place vote, then that person wins. But if nobody wins a majority of first place votes, then the candidate who has the least number of first place votes is deleted from the ballots. That person is rejected. And on every ballot where that person occurs, the person ranked under him moves up to take his place. And then you go through the process again. So now, because we've deleted the person who had the least number of first place votes, other candidates will be getting more first place votes. And now we count the first place votes again. And we just keep repeating this process until somebody wins a majority of first place votes. The problem with that algorithm is that when it's making these decisions as to who should be deleted, which candidate should be rejected, it's only looking at first place rankings. It's completely ignoring the voters' preferences farther down in the ballot. And because of that, very strange things can happen. If there is a candidate who has very broad support among the voters and wins a clear majority of second place votes, for example, that candidate could be the one that gets rejected first if he has a small number of first place votes, despite the fact that the vast majority of voters prefer that candidate to almost every other candidate who's running. And it could even be the case, and often is the case, that that candidate would win in every pairwise head-to-head contest with all the other contenders, but still gets rejected by this instant runoff algorithm because the algorithm ignores so much of the voter's preference information. That's a fatal flaw. And it brings up an important concept that we should mention here, and that is the Condorcet candidate. This is a concept from the Marquis de Condorcet some years ago, who said that in a contest like this, where you have multiple contenders, the candidate who should win is the one who defeats all other contenders in pairwise contest, in all possible pairwise contests. The one that defeats all the others is obviously the one preferred by a majority of voters. And the only problem with that is that sometimes there won't be any candidate who meets that criterion.
You use the illustration of the rock, paper, scissors problem of there might be in the case of three candidates, there might be a case where no one candidate beats the other two.
Yes.
Simultaneously.
That's correct. And that's exactly the kind of problem where you fail to get a Condorcet candidate. You get these cycles where nobody beats everybody else. And rock, paper, scissors is a classic example of that. So, what do we do?
Yeah, there is a variant that you describe in more than one of your articles, devised first by Joseph M. Baldwin in 1926, Baldwin being the astronomer and mathematician from Australia, and independently arrived at by Danny Kleinman in the 1960s, which you found out about because he actually contacted you himself. I don't know how much recognition Danny Kleinman has gotten for his work in kind of independently coming up with this, what he calls single office majority election, or SOME, which manages to avoid this fatal flaw, at least in theory.
Yes. It does, in fact, avoid the fatal flaw. In fact, you can prove mathematically that if there is a Condorcet candidate, Kleinman's algorithm, or the Baldwin algorithm, we really should call it, is guaranteed, mathematically guaranteed, to find the Condorcet candidate and identify that person as the winner. But it also has the strength that in those cases where there is no Condorcet candidate, where there is no candidate who defeats all others in all possible pairwise contests, the Kleinman or the Baldwin algorithm is very good at arguably coming as close as you can hope to come. The winner that it picks is the candidate who comes as close as any candidate can come to meeting the Condorcet criterion. In other words, that's the candidate who would win the most pairwise contests. So maybe I should just describe what that algorithm does and how it works. It's
that was, you just anticipated my next question.
Okay, so. Great. We're on the same wavelength here. The algorithm works by every candidate is given a score on each ballot according to where the candidate is in the ranking. And it's a very simple score to understand. The name of the score is the Borda count, Borda, named after yet another person who's important in the history of these algorithms. But the concept is actually very simple. So if you rank, let's say, three candidates, let's say Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, and Jill Stein, and you rank them in that order, Clinton, Trump, and Stein. Clinton is the most preferred, Trump is the middle, and Stein is the least. The Borda count for each candidate is the number of candidates ranked below that candidate. So Stein is at the very bottom of the list. Nobody is below her. She gets a 0. Trump is in the middle. He has only one candidate below him, and so he gets a 1. And Clinton is at the top of the list. She has 2 candidates ranked below her. She gets a 2. It's really that simple. And you can also accommodate tied rankings by splitting the board account for the tied candidates. So you go through all the ballots and you give each candidate a score, a board account score, as I've just described it, for each ballot. And then for each candidate, you go across all ballots and add up the board accounts that they get from all the ballots. Then you take the candidate who has the lowest board account. That will be the candidate who is on average ranked lowest by all voters. That's the least relevant candidate. That is the least preferred candidate. That is the candidate who would lose the most pairwise contests with other candidates. You take that candidate and you reject that one. That's the first thing that this algorithm does. It rejects the lowest scoring candidate, the one with the lowest board account. That is the one who is ranked last by the voters. So that's an important distinction with the algorithm we were talking about a few minutes ago, where you were discarding the candidate who had the smallest number of first place votes. Here, we're discarding the candidate who has the greatest last place votes. So you're discarding the candidate who is arguably the least relevant in the process. And then, having discarded that candidate from all the ballots, you go through and recalculate all the board accounts and repeat the process. Find the one who is now has the lowest board account, the least preferred, and reject that one. And you do this again and again until you have rejected all but one candidate. And the one surviving candidate is mathematically guaranteed to be the Condorcet candidate if there is one. And if there isn't, the surviving candidate is pretty much sort of qualitatively guaranteed to be the candidate who would come closest to meeting that criterion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And just hearing it described and kind of pondering what it would look like, the implications, one can immediately come up with any number of benefits that this would confer to the modern political scene. I like how it would incentivize civility, where candidates are incentivized not to kind of spew vitriol at each other.
Right, exactly.
Because they might end up being the vice president or in some other high office under whoever becomes president.
Right, exactly. One of Kleinman's great suggestions was that to pick the vice president, we should not do what we do now, which is to have the presidential candidate just pick his personal favorite choice for vice president. What we should do instead is run the algorithm I just described, this Baldwin algorithm, where you find the Condorcet candidate if there is one. You take the winner off the ballot and then run the algorithm again. And then the winner that you get is the one who is arguably the second place favorite of all the voters to be president. So now you've just run the algorithm twice and selected a president and a vice president. And if you have a field of contenders like that, it does not make sense for you to go attacking the other candidates if you might be serving under them as vice president. Also, it doesn't make sense to attack other candidates if you want to appeal to their voters for the second place vote. If you're trying to appeal to voters, obviously you're trying to get first place votes. But sometimes when you're talking to voters, you know that they actually prefer some other candidate. But if you can make the case to them that you actually have a lot in common with their favorite candidate, that you agree on gun control or healthcare or whatever, and try to persuade them to, okay, if you like him better, fine, I understand that, but give me your second place vote, because he and I agree on so many things, and I admire him, and he's a good man, and he thinks I'm a good person, and it just naturally creates these incentives for civil discourse.
And I think that civil discourse has the potential under that system to spread into the public as well. Because today, currently, the primaries have kind of created this climate of tribalism where people are not just portraying the other camp or the other tribe as misguided, they're portraying them as actually evil. And the primary system contributes to this. I think it probably goes even deeper into human psychology, which will probably never go away anytime soon, because our brains are essentially the same
yes.
as it was 200,000 years ago.
Yeah, we're tribal animals. It's hard to get away from it.
Mm-hmm. But we can mature and kind of grow out of the childhood of our species, which we need to do at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later. And so, yeah, I like that advantage as well. So what are some things that need to happen? Like, how can we, if this is the change that people prefer and people want, or if there's some other system that people would like to experiment with, just simply in the interest of getting us away from this outdated and kind of kludged together primary process, what changes need to happen to open the way for these other experimental alternatives to be tried?
Well, there are several things going on that are hopeful signs. One is that ranked choice voting is being implemented in local elections in various places, in city, county, and state elections. Maine just passed back in 2016 a referendum for using ranked choice voting with the instant runoff algorithm, unfortunately, for choosing their governor. And that, as I understand it, has been blocked by their legislature because of various legal technicalities. And there's kind of a legal battle going on now over that. The voters are trying to pass a referendum to overcome the action of the legislature. I'm not sure how that's going to turn out, but people like the idea of ranked choice voting and pretty much like the way it turns out, even with the fatal flaw of instant runoff. And that's an encouraging sign. So advocating for ranked choice voting of some kind, whether it's the Baldwin method or not, I think is a step in the right direction. There's another movement underway. I've forgotten the name of it already, but it's kind of an agreement among states, an informal agreement among states, that if enough states sign on to this program, this agreement, that these states who pass this piece of legislation, they agree to give all of their electoral college votes to the winner of the popular vote. And it's a conditional thing that states are agreeing to, that takes effect only when enough states have signed on to it to give 270 or more electoral college votes to the winner of the popular vote. So it's kind of a way to get around the electoral college system without having to do a constitutional amendment. That's in progress, and there are more and more states, there are efforts in various states to try to get their states to agree to do this. That's a hopeful sign. Another suggestion that I think is possibly helpful would be to, again, do something kind of experimental, to have a requirement that on our presidential ballots we have not just the real ballot where we vote between who won the Republican and Democratic primaries, but also put a longer list of candidates on the ballot. Maybe everybody who participated in major debates in both parties. So that would be a fairly long list of candidates. And run ranked choice voting. Let voters rank them, knowing that their rankings have no effect on the outcome of the election. They're still on the ballot voting in the regular way, but just as a way of experimenting with it and getting a feel for what it would be like to have that many choices.
Right, and then at the end you could say, this is what would have happened if we had this system in place.
Yes, and you could even compare alternative algorithms. You could say, this is what would have happened if we had used instant runoff. This is what would have happened if we'd used the Baldwin method. This is what would have happened if we'd used the Condorcet method, and so on. And you could have a whole list of alternative outcomes to show people.
Mm-hmm. And this kind of nicely comes back around to our beginning discussion of using and utilizing science as a way of solving problems that face us in society, using the experimental approach to take a look at what empirically works and what doesn't. And I'm wondering where this proposal of the Baldwin or the Kleinman method and everything we've been talking about kind of ties into the hypothetical pragmatist party, as you call it. Would this, in your mind, be a consequence of something that replaces the Republican Party, or is it a step in replacing the Republican Party, which is, as you and many others have pointed out, dead at this point, essentially?
Yeah, the Republican Party is a fascinating and sad story. I've maybe by way of full disclosure, I should also state where I am on the political spectrum. I usually describe myself as sort of a left-leaning centrist. I'm not really an ideologue, but I tend to lean left on most issues. But I am very much closer to the center than to any fringe. And I admire several conservative thinkers. One of my favorites is David Brooks, a commentator on public television and columnist for the New York Times. And he and many other conservatives, and he is a bona fide conservative. There's no denying it. He's definitely a conservative. Many sharp thinking, educated conservatives despised Donald Trump and formed what they called the Never Trump movement. It was strictly a conservative Republican movement to try to keep Donald Trump from getting the nomination because they could tell the man was unqualified to be president, quite apart from any kind of ideological stance that he had. So those people like David Brooks now feel kind of divorced from the Republican Party. They feel like they're homeless, politically homeless, and he's often described himself that way. So what kind of party should they have now? What can they do politically now? And I think that if we had this system of some kind of ranked choice voting, and we get rid of the primaries and have some kind of ranked choice voting system, whether that's a Baldwin algorithm or some other one, it would make it easier for new parties to form and become real powerful enough forces in politics that they could grow and win elections. Right now, or the way our system works, the two political parties have a stranglehold, because if a third party candidate runs, they're almost always seen as just a spoiler. They have no chance of winning. If you vote for the Green Party or the Libertarian Party, you're just throwing away your vote. You really should be voting for Republican or Democrat if you want to have any influence on the outcome. But in a ranked choice voting system, that's not the case. You can vote for a third party candidate as your first choice without worrying about that, because you know, even if it does turn out to be true that you voted for someone who doesn't have a chance to win, your second place vote, your third place, and so on, all your other rankings that you've listed on your ballot are still there, and they will still give you a vote in deciding between a Republican or a Democrat, if that's what it comes down to. So ranked choice voting weakens the stranglehold of the two major parties and makes it easier for new parties to emerge. So for that reason alone, I think it could make it possible for a new party to emerge. Now, what that party would be, whether it would be the pragmatist party that I fantasized about in one of my articles, that I don't know. That we have no way of knowing how it will unfold, but at least it would make it possible and easier for new parties to emerge. And that I think can only be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Well, in kind of wrapping up, is there any last words of wisdom? And that's the phrase I always use at the end of this, is any last words of wisdom you want to leave people with who are thinking about these things, or any insights you want to share?
I guess for me, the bottom line is that it's not hopeless. It seems like dark times in American politics right now because of the extreme polarization and tribalism, and because of an election that seemed to ignore the will of the majority. But in fact, the problems that most brought that about are fairly easy to fix. There are technical problems in the way we do our voting, the way we do our primaries. There are technical, fairly straightforward, relatively simple fixes, algorithmic fixes for this problem. It still won't get rid of the problems we've talked about with human nature, our emotions, our intuitions, our irrationality. That stuff will still be there. But we can continue trying to chip away at that. And in the meantime, try to move towards a better political system, a better electoral system that more reflects the will of the majority. There is hope for that.
Good. And so where can people find you and your work if they're interested in reading more about this? You have a regular blog on Huffington Post, is that correct?
Yes, I do, although they've just discontinued that program recently. So
okay.
For many years, the Huffington Post had a program where they would invite bloggers to contribute. And every once in a while, they would promote one of their pieces and make it more visible on the Huffington Post. But for some reason, they just recently terminated that program. So all of the things I've written there are still there, but they won't let any of us bloggers add new things to their system, unfortunately. So what's there is there. So you can search for me on the Huffington Post, or you could go to my website, watheyresearch.com. I also have a blog there which has links to all the stuff that's just on my blog, on my website, plus the things that are also available on the Huffington Post. So you can find everything at watheyresearch.com.
Yeah, including your book, The Illusion of God's Presence,
right.
which we talked about on the other podcast, Trolling with Logic, and which is also fascinating in its own right, I think. And I don't know if you can talk about this here or not, but you have a sequel coming out, and do you have a date for that?
I don't yet have a date for that, unfortunately. It's a manuscript that emerged when I was writing what is now chapter 12 of The Illusion of God's Presence. It's called A Trick of the Brain. And when I wrote that, the chapter just grew and grew and grew. and I soon realized I had a chapter 150 pages long, and this was not going to work. So I have this extra manuscript that is much more specifically focused on the neuroscience of religious experience and emotion. And I'm still working on that. I need to flesh out parts of it. I need to update parts of it. So I'm still tinkering with that, but it's very nice. My wife actually likes it in some respects better than the first book. So I think it'll be good.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have a date yet. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fine. Very few authors do. Well, thank you for joining me and taking time out of your day to discuss these issues.
Well, it's been a pleasure and an honor. It's always fun to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to A Leap of Doubt. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. If you want to get involved in the kinds of discussions this show is meant to encourage, you can find a discussion group on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/ALOP discussion. You can follow me and get in touch with me on Twitter, where my username is @thenatheist. Feedback and criticisms are always welcome. The opening clip is an excerpt from the audiobook God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, courtesy of Hachette Audio. Text copyright 2007 by Christopher Hitchens. Audio production copyright 2007 Hachette Audio. Used with permission. The music is Jade by Esther Nicholson and is used under license. I'd like to take this moment to give a very special shout out to my 3 patrons, Jeff Prebeg, Jeannie Eichard, and Torsten Pill. If you enjoy the work I do, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/a leap of doubt.